Dad gave my inheritance to his affair partner's son. I exposed him at the funeral. You know that feeling when your whole world collapses in a single moment? That's exactly what happened to me when I sat in that lawyer's office and learned my father had given my entire inheritance to a stranger. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. That stranger wasn't just anyone. He was the son of my dad's affair partner, and I was about to make sure everyone knew the truth. What I did at my father's funeral would change everything, and honestly, I'd do it all over again. Stick around because this story of betrayal, secrets, and ultimate revenge will leave you speechless. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began. My name is Sarah, and I'm 28 years old working as a high school English teacher in suburban Chicago. My dad, Richard Morrison, was a successful real estate developer who built his empire from nothing, starting with a single rental property and turning it into a portfolio worth millions. Growing up, I had everything I needed, but what I wanted most was his time and attention, something that always seemed just out of reach. He was constantly working, constantly traveling, and constantly telling me that one day I'd understand why he sacrificed so much family time for business success. My mom died when I was 16 from breast cancer, and those 2 years watching her fade away were the darkest of my life. Dad threw himself even deeper into work after she passed, and I convinced myself it was his way of coping with grief. We grew distant, but I always thought we had an understanding that family came first, that blood meant something, that all his hard work was building a legacy for me. I visited him every month, called him every week, and genuinely tried to maintain our relationship despite the emotional distance. When he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 6 months ago, I took a leave of absence from teaching to help him through treatment and be by his side. Those final months were brutal in ways I never imagined. Dad's health deteriorated rapidly, and I watched this strong, stubborn man become a shell of himself. I moved into his house to provide the round-the-clock care, managing his medications, driving him to appointments, and holding his hand through the worst nights. He barely spoke during those weeks, and when he did, it was usually about business matters or random memories from his childhood. I kept hoping he'd open up, that we'd finally have those deep father-daughter conversations I'd always craved, but he remained emotionally closed off until the very end. When he passed away 3 weeks ago, I felt this strange mixture of grief and relief, thinking that at least his suffering was over. The day after the funeral, I received a call from his lawyer, Marcus Chen, asking me to come to his office for the reading of the will. I assumed this would be a formality, perhaps some paperwork to sign and discussions about how to handle Dad's properties and investments. Walking into that sleek downtown office, I felt numb but prepared to handle whatever administrative tasks came next. Marcus greeted me with an uncomfortable expression that should have been my first warning sign, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what he was about to tell me. Marcus cleared his throat and explained that my father had made significant changes to his will just 2 months before his death. My heart started racing because changes made that close to death usually aren't good news. He then informed me that the bulk of my father's estate, approximately $4.2 million in assets, properties, and investments, was going to someone named David Patterson. I literally laughed out loud because I thought there must be some mistake, that maybe this David person was a business partner or charity representative. But when I asked who David Patterson was, Marcus's face went pale, and he said something that shattered my entire reality. David Patterson was a 24-year-old man whom my father had been supporting financially for the past 8 years. The room started spinning as Marcus continued explaining that David was the son of a woman named Linda Patterson, someone my father had been involved with romantically. My hands started shaking uncontrollably as I processed what involved with romantically actually meant during the timeline Marcus was describing. Linda Patterson had worked as my father's personal assistant starting 20 years ago, right around the time my mother was first diagnosed with cancer. The affair had lasted for over 15 years, ending only when Linda died in a car accident 3 years ago. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach repeatedly. My father had been cheating on my dying mother with his assistant and then continued that relationship for over a decade afterward. But the betrayal went even deeper than infidelity. David wasn't even my father's biological son. Marcus confirmed this after I specifically asked, yet Dad had treated him like the child he actually wanted. While I was struggling to connect with my distant father, calling and visiting and trying so hard to maintain our relationship, he was building a completely separate life with another woman and her son. The man I'd cared for during his final agonizing months, the man whose bedpans I'd emptied and whose tears I'd wiped away, had left me virtually nothing. Marcus handed me a copy of the will, and seeing it in black and white made everything horrifyingly real. I received exactly $50,000, barely enough to cover a year's salary, while David got everything else. The will included a brief note from my father that read, "Sarah will be fine on her own. She's always been independent, but David needs this foundation to build his future." I read those words over and over, each time feeling a fresh wave of rage and heartbreak. My father genuinely believed that his affair partner's son deserved my family's legacy more than his actual daughter. After everything I'd done, every sacrifice I'd made, every attempt to bridge the gap between us, this was how little I meant to him. I left that office in a daze, drove home, and spent the next 3 days in my apartment crying, screaming, and trying to make sense of the senseless. My friends rallied around me, equally shocked and outraged, with my best friend Jessica suggesting I contest the will in court. But I did my research and learned that unless I could prove my father was mentally incompetent when he changed his will, I had almost no chance of winning. Dad had been sharp and clear-minded until his final week, and Marcus had documentation proving the will changes were made when Dad was fully capable. I felt completely powerless, robbed of both my inheritance and my right to fight back through legal channels. Then something shifted inside me on the 4th day. I was looking through old photo albums, seeing pictures of my parents' wedding and my childhood, when I found my mom's journals from her cancer years. Reading her words about how lonely she felt, how she suspected something was wrong but couldn't prove it, how she died probably knowing her husband had betrayed her, I felt this white-hot anger replace my grief. My father had stolen my mother's final years of peace, stolen my chance at a genuine father-daughter relationship, and now stolen my rightful inheritance. He didn't deserve to be remembered as the successful businessman and devoted father that everyone believed he was. That's when I decided to do something that many people might consider unforgivable. The funeral had already happened, but there was a memorial service planned for the following week at Dad's country club, a big, fancy event where all his business associates and friends would celebrate his life and legacy. I'd been dreading attending because I'd have to smile and accept condolences while knowing the truth about who he really was. But now I saw that memorial service as an opportunity, perhaps the only opportunity I'd ever have to reveal the real Richard Morrison to everyone who thought they knew him. I spent the next week preparing meticulously for what I was going to do. First, I gathered evidence. Copies of financial records showing payments to Linda Patterson over the years, bank statements showing tuition payments for David, and the will itself with that cruel note about me being independent. I hired a private investigator to find David Patterson and learn more about him and his relationship with my father. What the investigator discovered made my blood boil even more. David had known my father as Uncle Richard growing up, but learned the truth about their relationship when he turned 18. My father had apparently promised David he'd be taken care of, and David had been counting on that inheritance for years. I also tracked down photos of my father with Linda and David, including family-style pictures from vacations and holidays that must have happened during times Dad told me he was away on business trips. There they were, playing happy family at Disney World while I sat at home alone during Christmas break. Seeing those images of my father smiling with another woman's child, giving David the warmth and attention he never gave me, strengthened my resolve. I created a presentation, loaded it onto a USB drive, and prepared exactly what I would say when the moment came. I knew this would be nuclear, that there'd be no coming back from it, but I'd spent 28 years being the understanding daughter, and I was done protecting his image. The memorial service was held on a Saturday afternoon with over 200 people attending. The country club's main ballroom was decorated with photos of my father throughout his life, carefully curated images showing his business success and philanthropy. I wore a simple black dress and arrived early, making small talk with Dad's colleagues and friends, accepting their condolences and playing the role of the grieving daughter. Several of his business partners pulled me aside to tell me how proud Dad was of me, how he talked about me all the time, and each lie felt like another knife in my back. David Patterson was there too, standing awkwardly near the back, and when our eyes met, I saw guilt flash across his face before he quickly looked away. The service began with speeches from Dad's business partner, his golfing buddy, and his lawyer, Marcus, who somehow managed to talk about my father's integrity without choking on the irony. Then it was my turn to speak, the daughter's tribute that everyone was expecting to be emotional and touching. I walked up to the podium, looked out at all those faces expecting a tearful goodbye, and felt this strange calm wash over me. This was it, the moment where I'd either expose everything or lose my nerve and protect his reputation like the dutiful daughter everyone expected me to be. I took a deep breath and began speaking. I started conventionally, thanking everyone for coming and talking about my father's business accomplishments and community involvement. People were nodding sympathetically, some dabbing at their eyes with tissues. Then I said, "But there's something you all need to know about Richard Morrison, something I only discovered after his death, and I believe truth matters more than comfortable lies." The room went absolutely silent, and I could see people exchanging confused glances. I pulled out my laptop, connected it to the presentation screen, and watched as confusion turned to shock across the audience's faces. I told them everything. I explained about Linda Patterson, the affair that started while my mother was dying, and a secret relationship that lasted over 15 years. I showed them the financial records proving Dad had been supporting another family while claiming he was too busy building a business legacy for me. I displayed photos of Dad with Linda and David, images that made it undeniably clear this wasn't just some brief indiscretion, but an entire parallel life. Then I pulled up the will on the screen, zooming in on that section where David Patterson received $4.2 million, while I, his actual daughter who cared for him until his death, received $50,000. The reaction was immediate and intense. People were gasping, some standing up in shock, others grabbing their phones, presumably to take photos of the screen. I saw Marcus Chen's face go red as he realized what I was doing, and he started moving toward the podium, but I kept talking. I read my father's note aloud, his words about me being independent and David needing foundation, my voice shaking with rage. I told them about caring for Dad during his final months, about the leave of absence from my job, about emptying his bedpans and holding his hand, all while he knew he was leaving everything to another woman's son. Some people were crying now, but I wasn't sure if they were crying for me or crying from the shock of having their image of Richard Morrison completely destroyed. Then I spotted David in the back, trying to leave, and I called him out by name. "David Patterson, are you really going to leave before everyone knows the whole truth?" He froze, and all eyes turned to him. I told the audience that David had known about his relationship with my father for years, that he'd been promised this inheritance, and that he'd attended my father's funeral knowing he was about to take everything from the dead man's actual daughter. David's face crumbled, and he practically ran out of the ballroom, followed by whispers and pointing. I felt no sympathy for him because he'd made his choice years ago when he accepted my father's money and attention, knowing full well that I existed and was being pushed aside. Finally, I addressed my father directly, speaking to his photograph on the memorial display. I told him that he'd failed as a husband, watching his wife die while sleeping with his assistant. I told him he'd failed as a father, choosing emotional distance and ultimately financial abandonment over genuine connection with his daughter. And I told him that unlike him, I valued truth over appearances, which is why I refused to let him be remembered as someone he never was. Then I unplugged my laptop, gathered my things, and walked out of that ballroom with my head held high, leaving behind a room full of shocked, angry, and confused people processing the destruction of Richard Morrison's carefully crafted legacy. The aftermath was intense and immediate. My phone exploded with calls and texts, some supportive but many accusatory. Several of Dad's business associates called me cruel and vindictive, arguing that I disrespected his memory and hurt innocent people with my dramatic display. Dad's brother, my Uncle Tom, left me a voicemail calling me an embarrassment to the family and saying I'd never be welcome at family gatherings again. But interestingly, some people reached out to thank me for telling the truth, including 2 of Dad's employees who'd suspected the affair years ago and felt validated. My mom's sister, Aunt Jennifer, called crying, but told me she was proud of me for defending her sister's memory, even if it came decades too late. The story spread quickly through Dad's social circles and business community. Within days, the country club was buzzing with gossip, and I heard through friends that several people had distanced themselves from Dad's former business partners, viewing them as complicit or willfully blind. Marcus Chen called me multiple times, alternating between anger at being blindsided and legal warnings about potential defamation, though we both knew everything I'd said was provably true. The local newspaper even picked up the story after someone at the memorial leaked details, running a piece about inheritance disputes and secret families that didn't name my father but was clearly about our situation. I gave an interview confirming the facts, figuring if I was already persona non grata in Dad's circles, I might as well own the narrative completely. David Patterson tried to reach me through Marcus, apparently wanting to explain or apologize, but I refused all contact. Several people told me I should have sympathy for him because he lost his mother and then Richard, but I couldn't find it in myself to care about his feelings. He was an adult who accepted money and gifts knowing they came at my expense, who attended my father's funeral and stayed silent about the will, and who would have happily taken my inheritance without a second thought. Yes, he'd been put in a difficult position by the adults in his life, but he'd still made choices, and I wasn't obligated to forgive him or make his life easier. Some called this cruel, but I called it self-preservation. About 2 weeks after the memorial service explosion, something unexpected happened. Marcus Chen called to inform me that 3 of my father's business partners wanted to meet with me privately. I was suspicious, assuming they wanted to yell at me or convince me to issue some sort of public apology, but when I met with them at a neutral location, they surprised me completely. They explained that after learning the truth about my father's secret life and the will situation, they'd discussed the matter and felt the inheritance arrangement was fundamentally wrong. Together, they offered to hire a top-tier legal team to help me contest the will pro bono because they felt they'd unknowingly benefited from business relationships with a man who'd betrayed his family so thoroughly. I was stunned by their offer, but cautiously interested. They explained that while contesting the will was difficult, there might be grounds to argue undue influence, especially if we could prove David or his mother had manipulated my father's decisions. They also suggested we might find evidence that Dad wasn't as mentally competent during those final months as Marcus claimed. I'd dismissed legal action earlier, but with serious lawyers and resources behind me, maybe there was a chance. We agreed to move forward. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt hope that justice might actually be possible. The irony wasn't lost on me that Dad's business associates, strangers essentially, were fighting harder for me than my own father had. The legal battle that followed was exhausting and emotionally draining. Our lawyers deposed David, Marcus Chen, and several of my father's business partners and medical caregivers from his final months. We discovered that Linda Patterson had been in significant debt when she died, and that David had student loans and credit card bills that my father had quietly been paying off. This suggested a financial dependency that might have influenced Dad's will changes. We also found evidence that in his final weeks, Dad's pain medication had occasionally left him confused, though proving this affected his legal competency was challenging. David's lawyers argued he was a grieving young man who'd lost both parental figures and deserved the inheritance Dad wanted him to have, painting me as a vindictive daughter trying to steal from a vulnerable person. 5 months into the legal proceedings, something shifted. David reached out directly, bypassing lawyers, leaving me a voicemail that was clearly recorded under duress or emotional breakdown. He admitted that the legal fight was destroying him emotionally and financially, that he couldn't afford his legal fees much longer, and that he'd begun to understand how wrong the situation was. He said he'd initially felt entitled to the inheritance because Richard had promised it, and because his mother had sacrificed so much working for my father, but seeing everything laid out in court documents made him realize the betrayal from my perspective. He proposed a settlement. He'd take $1 million and whatever personal items of his mother's my father had kept, and I'd get everything else, approximately $3.2 million in assets and properties. I discussed the settlement offer with my legal team and the business partners supporting me. They advised that while we might win more in court, settlements eliminate risk and emotional toll, and this offer was reasonable given the circumstances. I agreed to the terms with one additional condition. David had to sign a statement acknowledging the affair, its timeline, and the impact on my mother and me, which would be placed in the public record. I wanted documented proof that couldn't be disputed later, ensuring the truth was preserved beyond just my word against his. David agreed after some hesitation, and we finalized the settlement. It wasn't the full inheritance I should have received automatically, but it was partial justice and complete vindication. Now, 8 months after my father's death and 3 months after the settlement, I'm rebuilding my life with the resources I fought for. I used part of the inheritance to pay off my student loans, buy a house, and create an investment portfolio that will provide long-term security. I also established a scholarship fund in my mother's name for children who've lost parents to cancer, channeling some of Dad's wealth towards something meaningful that he never bothered to do. I returned to teaching, finding joy in my students and the knowledge that I'm making a positive difference in young people's lives, something my father claimed to value but never actually prioritized with me. My relationship with extended family remains complicated. Uncle Tom and some of Dad's side haven't spoken to me since the memorial service, apparently unable to forgive me for airing family business publicly. But my mom's family has been incredibly supportive, with Aunt Jennifer telling me repeatedly that my mother would be proud of me for fighting back and refusing to be silenced. I've made peace with losing relationships that were apparently conditional on me staying quiet and protecting a dead man's undeserved reputation. The friends who matter stuck by me, and I've even started dating someone who knows the whole story and admires that I stood up for myself instead of accepting injustice quietly. As for David Patterson, we have no relationship and probably never will. I heard through mutual connections that he moved to another state, used his settlement money to finish his education, and is trying to rebuild his life away from the scandal. Part of me hopes he's learned something from this experience about complicity and consequences, but honestly, his journey isn't my concern anymore. I spent too many years caring about people who didn't care about me with the same intensity, and I'm done with that pattern. He got more than he deserved considering he had no blood relation or legal claim to my father, and if he's smart, he'll recognize that and move forward without looking back. People still ask me if I regret exposing my father at his memorial service. They suggest I could have handled it privately, that public humiliation was unnecessarily cruel, that I destroyed his legacy out of spite rather than justice. But here's what I tell them. My father had years to make things right, to be honest, to split his assets fairly, or at minimum to explain his choices to me before he died. He chose deception and betrayal instead. He chose to let me care for him without warning me what was coming. He chose to prioritize his guilt over his affair partner and her son over his relationship with his actual daughter. Every choice that led to that memorial service moment was his, not mine. I simply refused to participate in the cover-up. Would I do it again, knowing the fallout and family rifts and months of legal battle? Absolutely yes. That moment at the podium, watching the truth dismantle my father's false image, was the first time I felt powerful instead of powerless in our entire relationship. For 28 years, I'd bent myself into shapes, trying to earn his love and approval, and it was never enough, because the problem was never me. He was broken in ways I couldn't fix, selfish in ways I couldn't excuse, and dishonest in ways that poisoned everything he touched. Exposing him wasn't about revenge, though it certainly felt satisfying. It was about refusing to let his lies be the final word on our family story. The truth is complicated and painful, but it's still truth, and I believe it deserves to be told. My father spent decades hiding behind respectability and success, using his business achievements to obscure his personal failures. Nobody questioned the great Richard Morrison, and that lack of accountability enabled him to hurt people without consequences. By speaking up, I denied him the peaceful, honored exit he thought he'd engineered. I made sure that anyone who celebrated his life knew exactly what they were celebrating, flaws and all. Some call this vindictive, but I call it honest, and I'd rather be honest and disliked than complicit and accepted. So if you're listening to this thinking about your own situation, whether it's inheritance issues or family betrayals or secrets you're expected to keep, here's what I want you to know. You don't owe protection to people who didn't protect you. You don't owe silence to people who silenced your needs and feelings. You don't owe a peaceful legacy to someone who left you with painful truth. It's scary to speak up, to risk relationships and face consequences, but living with injustice and swallowing truth is its own kind of death, slow and bitter. I chose the quick, painful route of exposure over the slow, painful route of silent acceptance. And despite everything, I sleep better at night knowing I fought back. My father taught me many lessons during his life, though not the ones he intended. He taught me that success and wealth mean nothing without integrity and genuine connection. He taught me that secrets always have costs, usually paid by people who didn't create them. He taught me that being independent and strong, qualities he claimed to admire in me, sometimes means standing alone against everyone's expectations. And perhaps most importantly, he taught me exactly the kind of parent I never want to be if I have children someday. Someone whose love is conditional, whose attention is divided, and whose legacy is built on lies. For those lessons, brutal as they were, I suppose I should thank him. Thanks for sticking with this story all the way to the end. I know it was heavy and complicated, and there are probably 100 different opinions about whether I did the right thing. That's okay, because I'm not looking for universal approval or validation anymore. I'm just telling the truth as I lived it. And if it resonates with someone else going through something similar, if it helps even one person realize they don't have to accept unfair treatment just because it comes from family, then sharing this story was worth whatever judgment comes with it. Life's too short to protect people who wouldn't protect you, and legacies should be earned through actions, not maintained through silence. Take care of yourselves out there, and remember, you're worth fighting for, even if you have to be the one doing the fighting.